Did you know? Without fungi, you'd probably be dead. And I'm not even just talking about penicillin. See, fungi are part of the natural process for breaking down organic material and turning it into carbon, oxygen, nitrogen, and phosphor, which is released into the atmosphere, which allows us to continue to live on this planet. Not only that, but no fungus, no beer. And yet, very few worlds focus on fungi development. You don't hear that much about mushrooms. I will admit that the one exception to this rule is when mushrooms are used as houses for fairies. I don't know how many of you have watched the Smurfs when you were small, but they used to live in those houses, and there was a show called Davy die Kabouter that used to live in a little mushroom house. So, mushrooms have been seen as houses for fairies, but other than that, they seem to have minimal impact on many fantasy worlds. And yet, they're a pretty critical part of life as we know it. So today, let's talk about fungi. Welcome to another episode of Just in Time Worlds with your host, Marie Mullany. If you've not yet done so, please do hit the subscribe button down below. If you want to join my community of world builders, links to my Discord is in the description, as well as a link to my Ko-fi page and my book if you want to support me in making more of these videos. Okay, let's get cracking. So one of the first things that I think we should talk about in talking about fungus is how they grow, because it is actually quite different from how a plant grows or how an animal grows. See, the reason why fungi can grow so fast, as shown in the time lapses, is because they grow through cell enlargement. They literally just explode into growth. And that's why they can pop up overnight and you can go from having no mushrooms to having a field of mushrooms. This makes for a very interesting aspect if you take fungi and you make them sentient. If they grow like this, what happens to their life cycle? And you can see this with the orkz from Warhammer 40k, in that their spores hit a world, and that's it. That world is forever infested by orkz. But also, they grow very fast, because that's how mushrooms grow. So if you are going to use mushrooms as the principal base for a sentient species on your world, whether mobile or immobile, it is worth considering what happens to their life cycle when they can essentially go from zero to hero overnight. The other thing to consider is, as I said, the spores. Again, the Warhammer 40k orcs, once their spores have considered to infect a world, quite often that world is written off by the Empire, because you can never fully get rid of those spores. And the right circumstances comes along and off the spores grow, making more orcs. The other fascinating thing about mushrooms is their communication. Now, when I discussed plant life, I spoke about the fact that plants communicate using chemicals. They put chemicals out into the air, and those chemicals bear messages to other plants and even to insects, so that insects can respond to the chemical messages that plants put out. Fungi, we think, communicate using electricity through their mycelium networks. So the mycelium network in and of itself is actually quite fascinating. Mycelium is incredibly tiny threads that connect various fungi plants together. It also wraps around or bores into tree roots. What this network does is it transfers nitrogen, water, and other critical minerals between fungal plants. So these are individual plants that are connected using the mycelium network. When I first read about the mycelium networks, my first thought was that they would make for a great platform for telepathic communication. They would make for a great platform for a species that could send each other resources as well as communicate between each other. So you can have a stationary colony of mushrooms that uses the network to extend to the next mushroom and extend to the next mushroom, and thus have this overarching kind of life force concept, which I thought would be a very interesting use of both magic and of a fungi as a life form. But I've recently read that fungi may in fact be using electrical impulses to communicate with each other in a similar fashion to how we communicate as humans. Like, they can communicate words to each other with their electrical impulses. So working on that principle with the mycelium network, you can build a civilization that potentially uses electricity as its magic system, uses electrical power as its magic system in order to achieve what it's looking to achieve, and then it has this network in between individual members to which it sends its required resources to continue expanding its civilization. And I think that would be a very interesting concept to explore in terms of the fungi of your world. Of course, whenever you do have plant-based races, there is the temptation to give them legs and turn them into tree ants or into orkz, Warhammer 40k orkz, that are of fungi descent but are still bipedal and can move by themselves. But you don't have to do this. There is an ant that is plagued by a particular type of fungi. Now, the fungi in question is called Orthiocordyceps unilitarialis, which is a terrible name and undoubtedly Latin. It was discovered by the British naturalist Alfred Russel Wallace in 1859. Now, what this fungus does is it grows onto the head of an ant, and it then takes control of that ant, and it makes the ant take it to where it wants to be, kind of like a beast of burden. It literally, in the end, kills the ant. But before it kills the ant takes the fungi to where it can propagate itself. The better name for this, rather than that Latin mouthful, is the zombie ant, which is amazing because that's exactly what's going on here. The fungi has literally settled on the ant's head and turned it into a zombie in order for the fungi to propagate, and the ant dies in the end. That, for me, sparked the idea of a civilization of mushrooms that take control of insects and force them to carry the mushrooms to where they want to be. Of course, this is rather a grim, dark civilization if you think about it, because not only are you not giving these creatures any kind of free will, you're killing them by taking them there. The whole fungi civilization is built on the dried up husks of ants. We must rise up, ant brethren, and overthrow the evil fungi. I got a little carried away there. That was a very interesting way of giving fungi mobility without necessarily giving them legs and turning them into a bipedal fungi race. So that was an in-depth look at means by which fungi could become an intelligent species and how you can use them as such in your world. But this is not the only impact that fungi has. As I mentioned at the start of this video, fungi are critically important to the biome of your world. So how can you use them other than as an intelligent species in your world? Well, obviously there are the things that they do in our world. There are poisonous mushrooms. There are mushrooms that you can make dyes from. There are mind-altering mushrooms. Now, mind-altering mushrooms are very interesting as well because it's fairly clear from our early history that shamans used mind-altering mushrooms in their religious rituals. So if you're building a world that has that kind of shamanistic practices, it would make complete sense to have those shamans know which mushrooms give you a good high and allow you to connect to the spirit world. Therefore, use those mushrooms in order to make their rituals happen, which of course allows for a great deal of plot elements, because now what happens if the mushroom crop fails? Can people just not connect to the spirit world? Do you find that the shaman's power starts failing because the mushroom crop has failed? There's all kinds of complications that can come from needing those mushrooms and then not having access to them. And as I mentioned, of course, fungi is critical in the production of booze. And it is, of course, a healing mechanism. Penicillin is from a fungi. That's what it is. Fungi combat bacteria, and of course, it is a very big deal if your civilization discovers that. But this is fantasy. So how can your fungi impact your magic system? Can you have for realsies magic mushrooms? To make it realistic, you can draw on a couple of attributes of mushrooms and of fungi in order to build your magic system to incorporate fungi or even to be primarily based on fungi. Let's start with that funky network of theirs and their ability to use electricity. So you could use the fact that they generate electricity to communicate with as a power source for your magic. Maybe you have to have a whole little mushroom farm which then generates this electrical power which the mage then takes and uses to affect his magic. Or maybe it's a communication-based thing. Maybe you can use a sympathetic magic model where you've got a network of fungi and they are distributed around a picture of a map. And then you can use that network in an as below, so above sympathetic magic principle, where you can send messages on the map that become messages in the real world. Perhaps even resources the way that mushrooms would send. Maybe you can send minerals through that network that translate into food arriving in the big world, in the above world, when the mushrooms go through. It would also make sense to have mushrooms involved in your healing magic. As I said, they combat penicillin. They also have this growth ability that we spoke about, where their cells enlarge through water. Maybe that enlargement could be used as a healing mechanism to plug up a wound to allow it to heal properly. Of course, mushrooms do glow in the dark, so you could use them as a natural light source, but you can also use them as a potential sympathetic light source where you go, here is the mushroom, and then you elevate its light by means of magic. Or maybe even you agitate its electrical impulses so that its light becomes brighter, and so you use the mushroom as a torch. And then the last part where I could see mushrooms having an impact on your magic system is in renewal and disposal. As I said in the beginning, mushrooms are a critical part of maintaining your world. They break down organic matter and turn it into its base chemical components, carbon, oxygen, nitrogen. So you could have them involved in your magic system on that kind of level where they impact that renewal, that breakdown of something that has served its purpose and its return to base components, thus becoming again part of the greater whole and the biome that it lives in. And those are my thoughts on fungi in a fantasy world. I hope that you've enjoyed this episode of Just in Time Worlds. Please do hit the thumbs up button if you did. If you'd like to support me in making more of these, links to my Ko-fi and my books down below. And I will see you soon for another episode of Just in Time World.